Section 25 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary, Chapter 6, Part 2. One of Mary's earliest cares had been to provide a series of orthodox masses for the soul of her father, and for this purpose she wished to appropriate certain rectoral tithes belonging to Kendal Church, then in possession of the crown. She consulted her ecclesiastic confidants on the matter, but they assured her that the Pope would never permit the endowments of a parish to be appropriated to the assistance of so determined an enemy of the Church as Henry VIII. She, in the hope that her father's soul was not wholly beyond the reach of intercession, presented the advowson to a college he had refounded at Cambridge, saying, that as his benefaction to this college was the best thing he had done for himself, the best thing she could do, to show her duty, was to augment its revenues for his sake. Among the popular accusations against Mary is a very terrible one, no other than that she instigated an ecclesiastical council to exhume her father's bones, to be burnt for heresy. At the very time when Mary is represented as encouraging such parricidal insults on her father's body, she was occupied in fond, vain solicitude for the comfort of his soul, and was actually sparing endowments from her poverty, in hopes that his state might be ameliorated. Dr. Weston, whose name has been already mentioned, was the author of this scandal, and Fox himself owns that his motive for promulgating it was because Cardinal Pole insisted on suspending him from his functions in the Queen's Chapel on account of his immoral life. Mary, of course, acquiesced in this decree, or at least did not interfere to prevent it. Weston was one of the furious persecutors of the Bonner and Gardiner class. A good Benedictine historian records, with disgust, a repartee of this bad man, in reply to one of the Protestant martyrs, who said, in answer to his accusations of heterodoxy, "We have the word." "Aye," replied the persecutor, "but we have the sword." The proto-martyrs of the Protestant Church of England were men of blameless lives and consistent conduct. Their leader was Prebend Rogers of St. Paul's, who was burnt at Smithfield, February 4, 1555. The same week were burnt Sanders, rector of All Hallows at Coventry, Dr. Rowland Taylor at Hadley, and Bishop Hooper at Gloucester. All were offered their lives as the price of apostasy, but all remained firm in their faith. The martyrdom of Bishop Hooper was a peculiar instance of ingratitude in Mary's government, for his loyalty to her had been as firm as his adherence to his church. He wrote a narrative of his conduct, in which he says, with native simplicity, "When Queen Mary's fortunes were at their worst, I rode, myself, from place to place, as is well known, to win and stay the people for her party. And whereas when another was proclaimed, that was Lady Jane Grey, I preferred our queen, notwithstanding the proclamations. I sent horses to both shrines, Gloucester and Worcester, to serve her in great danger, as Sir John Talbot and William Lygon, Esquire, can testify." At the end of the week of crime, which saw the sufferings of these four good men, Alfonso de Castro, a Franciscan friar, confessor to King Philip, preached before the court a sermon, inveighing against the wickedness of burning them. He boldly declared the truth, that the English bishops learned not, in Scripture, to burn anyone for conscience sake. This truly Christian sermon produced an order from court, whether from the queen or her husband is not known, to stop the burnings for upwards of 5 weeks, which raised hopes of future clemency, but in vain; for, at the lowest computation, above 200 human creatures perished, before the persecution and Mary's reign ceased together. In February 1555, Christian III, King of Denmark, wrote an excellent letter to Queen Mary, claiming Bishop Coverdale, the translator of the English Bible, as his subject. Thus, to the joy of all humane persons, was a good and learned man delivered from a dreadful death. So much ridicule has been cast on the mistake made in the queen's situation, that no person has asked the obvious question of, Who governed England during the time which embraced the commencement of the Protestant persecution and her violent illness? How violent that illness was may be learned from the testimony of the Venetian ambassador, Michel. From the time of her first affliction, she was a prey to the severest headaches, her head being frightfully swelled. She was likewise subject to perpetual attacks of hysteria, which other women exhale by tears and piercing cries. From this notice may be implied that the wretched queen still retained sufficient command of herself to suppress all audible plaints, as unbecoming her royal station. Who can, however, believe that a woman in this state of mortal suffering was capable of governing a kingdom, or that she was accountable for anything done in it? Fox, in his narrative of the sufferings of the Protestant martyrs, whenever the queen is mentioned, really confirms the description of Michel. Sometimes, he reports, she laid weeks without speaking, as one dead, and more than once the rumour went that she had died in childbed. The females of her household and her medical attendants still kept up the delusive hope that her accouchement was at hand. Prayers were put up for her safe delivery in May 1555, and circulars were written, similar to those prepared at the birth of Queen Elizabeth and Edward VI, in which blanks were left for dates, and for the sex of the royal offspring. The news was actually carried to Norwich and Flanders, that a prince was born, and some public rejoicings made in consequence. She continued in a deplorable state of health throughout the summer, and was advised to remove, for the air of the country. This removal is thus minutely described by Strype's manuscript chronicler. July 21st, 1555. The queen removed from St. James's Palace in the Fields. Passing through Whitehall and the Park, she took her barge at Whitehall Stairs to Lambeth, my lord cardinal's house. There she mounted into her chariot, and rode through St. George's Fields to Newington, and over Newington Fields to Eltham Palace, where she arrived at 5 in the afternoon. Cardinal Pole, Lord Pembroke, Lord Montague, and many more of her court, following on horseback, and a vast conflux of people to see her grace, above 10,000. This seems her first appearance since her illness. Whilst Mary lay between life and death, only animated by a hope which every day became fainter, the conduct of her young husband was by no means edifying to her court. Fortunately the queen had chosen maids of honour, whose correctness of life was unimpeachable, who were not only ladies of approved virtue, but ready to do battle, if any audacious offender offered an incivility. Of this praiseworthy spirit, the beautiful Lady Magdalen Dacre, who married, in the next reign, Viscount Montague, afforded a signal instance. One day, as she was at her toilet, King Philip, who had observed a small window which lighted her dressing room, from a corridor at Hampton Court, contrived to open it far enough to put in his arm. When the fair maid of honour, justly indignant at a liberty she never encouraged, took up a staff which stood apropos in the corner, and gave the intruding arm so sound a rap, that Philip was glad to withdraw it back in a hurry, and to make a speedy retreat. He took no offence at this specimen of an English lady's spirit, but was ever afterwards observed to treat the heroine of the staff with remarkable deference. The fair Dacre was of so stately a presence, that she towered above all the ladies of the court in height. She was maid of honour afterward to Queen Elizabeth, but was accustomed to speak with infinite scorn of the immorality of her court, when compared to that of Queen Mary. When Philip found that the ladies of his wife's household were too respectable to give the least encouragement to his advances, it is affirmed that he formed disreputable acquaintances with females of low condition. At least, such is the testimony of a contemporary pamphlet, published for the purpose of inflaming the English against the Spanish influence in the Privy Council. This singular pamphlet is affirmed to be written by John Bradford, afterwards martyred for religion, but the tenor of it is such that good proof ought to be afforded that Bradford really wrote it, before it is seriously attributed to him, so completely is it at dissonance with his venerated character. Whoever wrote it, the whole may be considered as a collection of the popular reports afloat concerning King Philip. The author accounts for his knowledge of the king's conduct as follows. Ye would say, what could this fellow hear and see? In truth, I was chamberlain to one of the privy council, and with all diligence gave myself to write and read Spanish, which once attained, I kept secret from my master and fellow servants, because I might be trusted in my master's closet or study, where I might read daily such writing as I saw often brought into the council chamber, which thing I did as opportunity served. I saw certain letters sent from the emperor half a year before King Philip left England, wherein was contained these secrets: that King Philip should make his excuses to Queen Mary, that he would go to see his father in Flanders, promising to return immediately. The good simple queen is so jealous of my son, I term it as the letters doth. We shall make her agree to all our request before his return, or else keep him here exercised in our affairs. No man can think evil of the queen, though she be somewhat moved, when things are beaten into her head by her gentlewomen. This was the idea of her adopting her husband as heir of England, to the exclusion of Elisabeth. God is my witness, that my heart will not suffer me to declare the vile reports that I have heard the Spaniards speak against the queen, and yet her grace taketh them from her faithful friends. He goes on to draw a laughable picture of what the English court will be, if the Spaniards have entire rule in England. The court shall be kept more like a hostelry or tavern than a noble house. Let them report that have been at Brussels, at the emperor's court, where is to be sold both wine and beer out of the emperor's cellar, as at any vintner's in the city. Yea, and the best of your lordships shall never be trusted to stay at home, but shall have to wait on King Philip abroad, and be glad to lie in a victualling house, where ye shall think to fare well, if ye have half a lean roasted capon to dinner, and as much to supper, perhaps a pint of thin wine and water, or else half a loin of lean mutton, a pig's pettitoe, and half a dozen green salads. Then ye will say, would to God we had kept the crown for the right heir! But peradventure, her grace the queen thinketh King Philip will keep her more company and love her the better, if she will give him the crown. A ribald rhyme is then quoted, alluding to one of Philip's supposed intrigues. It seems part of a ballad of no great edification, saying that the king liked the baker's daughter in her russet gown better than Queen Mary without her crown. The Council of Spain, continues the author, purposeth to establish other nations, and to appoint in England a viceroy, with an army of Spanish soldiers, and let the queen live at her beads, like a good ancient lady. For the king, he likes better Antwerp, where he may go mumming and masking, yea, even in the holy time of Lent, night after night. I will tell you a true tale, in which the Spaniards glory. He then proceeds to tell a long story of the king and his noble attendants disguising themselves in women's apparel, and joining a company of merchants' fair wives at Antwerp, who were met together at the accouchement of one of their number, and that he shared in the gossip festival at the birth of the little Fleming, and assisted in the good woman's chamber. This true tale concluded with an apology, which indeed it needed. I would not have written this, had not the good Bishop of Carlisle been checked in his sermon, for he desired King Philip to leave his loathsome conduct and keep to his own wife. Not one word of virtuous sympathy is there in behalf of the suffering Protestants, neither does it accuse Mary of the least participation in the cruelties thus transacting. On the contrary, the author's tone is that of compliance with the prevailing religion. This tract seems to have been published soon after King Philip's departure from England, which took place September 1555, being occasioned by an event which filled all Europe with astonishment. This was the abdication of his father, the Emperor Charles, who, tormented with gout and weary of the cares of sovereignty, summoned his son to receive the resignation of his hereditary scepters. The queen had, in September, somewhat recovered, owing to the sagacity of an Irish physician, who ventured to pronounce a true opinion of her case, and apply proper remedies for her agonizing maladies. Mary then moved in state, by water, from Hampton Court to Greenwich Palace, from whence King Philip embarked to receive the Spanish sceptre. For a few afternoons the queen struggled to pay attention to business she had formerly done, but her health gave way again in the attempt, and she was seen no more at council. With her married life the independence of her reign ceased. From whatever cause, whether owing to her desperate state of health, or from her idea of wifely duty, Philip, whether absent or present, guided the English government. When he left England, the queen desired Cardinal Pole to make minutes of the king's last injunctions for the privy council, and they are still preserved in his handwriting. In another privy council journal extant, the English government, consisting of Gardiner, Winchester, Arundel, Pembroke, Page, and Peter, and the bishops of Ely and Rochester, gave Philip, as king, minute accounts of their proceedings, ecclesiastical and domestic. He wrote his mind on the opposite column, with no more recognition of his wife's authority than was observed by Henry VII. To Elizabeth of York, and he very coolly, in his own name, orders 12 ships of the English fleet to escort his abdicated father to Spain, without the ceremony of asking the leave of their royal mistress. These documents afford incontestable proof that Philip of Spain, not Mary of England, was the reigning sovereign after their hands were united. If this had not been the case, how could the truthful Fuller, the Protestant historian of the Church, who lived too near the times of Queen Mary to be deceived, thus speak of her? She had been a worthy princess, if as little cruelty had been done under her as by her. She hated to equivocate, and always was what she was, without dissembling her judgment or conduct, for fear or flattery. In the time of Queen Mary, says a minute of council, quoted by Strype, after the king of Spain was her husband, nothing was done in England without the privity and directions of the said king's ministers. Sir Thomas Smith, in an oration recommending single life to princes, by which word he means queen regnants, traces all the cruelty of Mary's reign to her marriage. This view of the subject is borne out by the contemporary biographer of Fox, the martyrologist, who calls Queen Mary a woman every way excellent, while she followed her own inclination. It is a historical mistake to suppose that Philip II. Had no power in the government of England. There was none legally given him by Parliament, but at the time of the Queen's dreadful illness he possessed himself of it. Although every generous feeling is naturally roused against the horrid cruelties perpetrated in her name, yet it is unjust and ungrateful to mention her maiden reign with unqualified abhorrence. For if the tyrannical laws instituted by her father had remained a few years more in force, the representative government of England would gradually have withered, under the terrors of imprisonment and executions without impartial trial, and regal despotism would have been as successfully established here as it was in France and Spain, by the descendants of Henry VIII's associates, Francis I. and Charles V. This change arose from the queen's own ideas of rectitude, for the majority of her privy councillors, judges, and aristocracy had as strong a tendency to corrupt and slavish principles as the worst enemy to national freedom could wish. Many wholesome laws were made or revived by her. Among others, justices of the peace were enjoined to take the examination of felons in writing, at the same time binding witnesses over to prosecute. Without these regulations, a moment's reflection will show that much malignant accusation might take place in a justice room, unless witnesses were bound to prove their words. All landholders and householders were made proportionably chargeable to the repairs of the roads. The jails were in a respectable state, since Fox allows that the persons imprisoned for conscience' sake were treated humanely in the prisons under royal authority, while the persecuting bishops made noisome confinement part of the tortures of the unhappy Protestants. Queen Mary is commended for the merciful provision she made for the poor. There is, however, no trace of poor rates levied from the community at large, like those established by her sister Elisabeth at the close of the 16th century. But that the poor were relieved by Mary is evident by the entire cessation of those insurrections, on account of utter destitution, which took place in her father's and brother's reigns, and now and then under the sway of Elisabeth. This is more singular, since corn was at a famine price, throughout the chiefest part of Mary's reign, owing to a series of inclement years and wet harvests. It seems likely that part of the church lands she restored were devoted to the relief of the destitute, since very few monasteries were refounded. In her reign was altered that mysterious law called the benefit of clergy. It had originated in the earliest dawn of civilization, when the church snatched, from the tyranny of barbarous and ignorant chiefs, all prisoners or victims who could read, and claiming them as her own, asserting the privilege of bringing them to trial. Thus were the learned judged by the learned, and the ignorant left to the mercies of those savage as themselves. This law tended to the encouragement of learning, in times when not more than one person out of 2,000 laymen knew a letter in the book. Since the comparative cessation from civil war, after the accession of Queen Mary's grandfather, general knowledge had surged forward in such mighty waves that the law of benefit of clergy, with many others of high utility 5 centuries before, were left without an object, their actual purposes having ebbed away in the transitions of the times. The law of sanctuary was one of these. Mary wished, when she refounded the monastery of Westminster, for the privileges of its sanctuary to be abolished, but Sergeant Plowden made a stand for them on legal grounds. Many customs and usages existed in the reign of our first queen regnant, which form amusing contrasts with the luxury and refinement witnessed under the sway of our present sovereign lady. Domestic cleanliness, in the reign of Queen Mary, was by no means an English characteristic. When a room was out of order, the floor was neither swept nor washed, but received a fresh strewing of green rushes, just like the littering of a farmyard when it is newly spread with straw, for the accommodation of the cows or pigs, and the old surface remains a fermenting mass beneath. Thus, layer of rushes accumulated over layer, covering up bones, fragments from the wasteful dining table, and other abominations. On occasions of dancing, all this litter was disturbed, by a circle being swept in the midst of the hall. The stone floor was thus made clear of encumbrances, while the extra littering was heaped up all around. This custom explains an expression used by Shakespeare and the early dramatists and chroniclers of "a hall," when persons wished to dance. Such was the call by which the domestics understood they were to sweep the dancing ring in the hall. How noxious the vapors of the newly disturbed compost must have been to persons warm with dancing may be supposed. The great philosopher of the 16th century, who evidently was not used to such dirty ways in his native Holland, attributed the various plagues, which then desolated England, to these horrid habits. His description is as follows. As to the floors, says Erasmus in his letter to Dr. Francis, they are usually made of clay, covered with rushes, that grow in fens. These are so little disturbed, that the lower mass sometimes remains for 20 years together, and in it a collection of every kind of filth. Hence, upon a change of weather, a vapor is exhaled, most pernicious to the human body. He declares this to be the reason England was so frequently afflicted with pestilence. The nobles were not a whit cleanlier than the country gentry, but as they usually were possessed of several seats, they indulged in the luxury of removing from one to another, when the insects, cherished by their dirty customs, became inconvenient. These progresses were elegantly termed going to sweeten. The most pitiful complaints were made by Lord Paget to Edward VI's privy council, because, being in disgrace, he was confined to Bow Desert, which he assured them, though pretty, was too small, and had withal become, by some months' residence, horribly unsavory, and could not be sweetened, without the removal of his family. The dwellings of the lower and middle classes were made of timber and clay, or of wattled sticks and mud. The Spaniards who came over with King Philip at first expressed great scorn of these mud edifices, which they termed the national architecture, but when they beheld the good living of the inhabitants, "The English," they said, "live in houses made of dirt and sticks, but they fare therein as well as their monarch." Queen Mary, having overcome the repugnance of the English to be governed by a sovereign lady, was disposed to place her own sex in stations of authority, of which there had been few examples before or since. She made Lady Berkeley a justice of the peace for Gloucestershire, and Lady Rous she appointed of the quorum for Suffolk, who did usually sit on the bench at assizes and sessions, among the other justices, cincta glaudo, girt with the sword. The Houses of Parliament had some customs now obsolete. It was necessary for a peer to obtain leave from the sovereign if he found it needful to absent himself when Parliament was sitting. Francis, Earl of Shrewsbury, being sick in the autumn of 1555, the queen granted him license of absence, and appointed the person she chose, or rather her government, for his proxy. Sir William Peter thus wrote to the sick earl: "This bearer, your servant, bringeth to you the queen's majesty's license to be absent from Parliament. I thought it good also to signify unto your lordship, that her majesty is very sorry for your sickness, and trusts, that giving yourself well to the recovery of your health, you shall, by God's grace, shortly grow strong again. In your proxy, her majesty prays you to name the Lord Montague and Bishop Ely jointly and severally." The earl thanked her majesty for appointing him such honourable representatives, and sent his proxy by his son. If a member of the lower house absented himself contumaciously, he lost his wages. The English drama assumed some likeness to its present form under her patronage. The old mysteries and moralities had given way before the regular plays of Plautus and Terence, acted in Latin by the boys of Westminster or St. Paul's School, who were chiefly the acolytes or assistants of the mass. Heywood, the queen's poet and dramatic writer, was frequently sent for in her long illness, and when she was able to listen to recitation, he repeated his verses, or superintended performances, for her amusement. The queen remained at Greenwich the remainder of the year 1555, so very sick and weak, that it was daily expected she would surrender her life where she drew her first breath. The autumn was unhealthy, owing to the incessant floods of rain. The Thames rose so high that Westminster Hall was under water, and wherries rode through it. Gardiner, the Lord Chancellor, died at the close of the same year. Mary severely felt his loss as a financier. For his integrity and sagacity were remarkable in pecuniary affairs. He managed her income so well, that her expenditure did not exceed the ancient revenues of the crown as long as he lived. Queen Mary permitted the Duchess of Northumberland to retain a maintenance sufficient to support her rank, through the intercession of Don Diego de Mondesa. There is reason to suppose the queen carried her generosity so far as to repossess the duchess in the royal palace at Chelsea, since she was buried at Chelsea Church in 1555, and left in her will to her son-in-law, Sir Henry Sidney. The green and gold hangings in the gallery in the manor house, Waterside, Chelsea. An alarming accident happened whilst the queen dwelt at Greenwich, owing to the forgetfulness of a gunner belonging to a ship passing down the Thames, who, intending to salute the palace, discharged a small cannon, or falcon, loaded with ball, which broke the windows of the queen's chamber, and the ball even penetrated into her room. The unlucky marksman was not punished for this unwelcome salute, as he pleaded accident. Mary once more appeared in public at the commencement of the year 1556, pale as a corpse, and looking 10 years older than when she was last seen. She reviewed her band of gentlemen pensioners in Greenwich Park, after which a tumbler came forth from the crowd, and volunteered so many droll antics for the royal diversion, that he elicited a hearty laugh and a reward from the sick queen. A deep obscurity remains on her locality through the chief part of this year, which was marked with persecution, insurrection, and famine, and the dreadful martyrdom of Cranmer took place in the spring. The utter paucity of all intelligence concerning the residence and movements of Mary, and her total absence from council, lead to the conclusion that she was on a sick bed again. She made no progresses in the summer. Indeed, such movements were impossible, in her desperate state of health, for, when she attempted them in her father's reign, she was usually carried home ill in a litter. Her affectionate maid of honour, Jane Dormer, who married a Spanish grandee, the Conde de Feria, and wrote her own memoirs, affirms that her royal mistress, when convalescent in the summer, retired to the palace at Croydon, which had been a dower residence to her mother, Catharine of Aragon. When her sole amusement was walking, plainly dressed, with her ladies, and entering the cottages of the poor, and, unknown to them, relieving their wants. She likewise chose those of their children that seemed promising, for the benefits of education. This account agrees with her extreme love of children, and the numerous godchildren and infant protégés on whom she lavished a great part of her narrow income, in her youth. The invalid queen, in her moments of convalescence, soothed her cares and miseries at the embroidery frame. Many specimens of her needlework were extant in the reign of James I, and are thus celebrated by Taylor, the poet of the needle. Mary here the sceptre swayed, and, though she were a queen of mighty power, her memory will never be decayed, which by her works are likewise in the Tower, in Windsor Castle, and in Hampton Court. In that most pompous room called Paradise, whoever pleaseth thither to resort, may see some works of hers of wondrous price (value). Her greatness held it no disreputation to hold the needle in her royal hand, which was a good example to our nation to banish idleness through her land, and thus this queen in wisdom thought it fit, the needle's work pleased her, and she graced it. Where the pompous room called Paradise at Hampton Court may be, must remain a mystery. But it was probably one of the ancient state apartments, destroyed by William III. To make way for the quadrangle, built and ornamented in the mode à la Louis XIV. It is easy to surmise that it was hung with tapestry representing the Garden of Eden, with beasts, birds, and plants, depicted according to such artistic ideas as Mary and her maids of honor might possess, when delineating subjects of natural history and cross-stitch. Catharine of Aragon, the mother of Queen Mary, commenced ornamenting the state apartments in the Tower. According to Taylor, Mary finished the splendid and elaborate tapestry begun by her mother, but all vestiges of the royal apartments of the Tower were swept away by the destructive warfare in the succeeding century. The very site has become a matter of dispute. And with these antique palatial lodging rooms vanished the united labours that Queen Mary and her mother had bestowed on their hangings and furniture. It is possible that some remains of Mary's needlework may exist at Windsor Castle. It is known, from her privy purse expenses, that she worked an enormous armchair, as a New Year's gift for her father, Henry VIII. And there is reason to suppose it is the specimen of Mary's needlework Taylor alludes to, as well known at Windsor. A series of plots and insurrections took place, agitated by a younger brother of the Stafford family, who was a nephew of Cardinal Pole, and had been malcontent before his uncle returned to England. The French ambassador was, as usual, concerned with this rising, which had several ramifications, in which two of the household of the Princess Elisabeth were again concerned, and when arrested, they accused their mistress of participation. The princess, however, had not the least difficulty in convincing her sister of her innocence, who sent her a ring, in token of her confidence. The officers of Elisabeth were executed. A new disturbance was raised in July by an impostor, who personated the deceased Earl of Devonshire, and who actually proclaimed himself and Elisabeth king and queen. This trying circumstance produced no division between the royal sisters, nor did the populace take the slightest interest in the attempts of any of the disturbers. Lord Bray, the son-in-law of the Earl of Shrewsbury, was confined in the Tower, being accused of participation in Stafford's revolt. Lady Bray was admitted to the Queen's presence, and pleaded the cause of her lord very earnestly and successfully. Mrs. Clarenceux, the Queen's old maid, came to Lady Bray, with kind words from her Majesty, and invited her to dine with her, and led her by the hand through the court to her chamber. And this was thought to be by the Queen's special commandment. The Queen, 2 days after, spoke of the devotion of the young wife with great praise, but added with emphasis, which it was thought alluded to her own case, that God sent ofttimes to good women evil husbands. The stout gospeller, Edward Underhill, escaped all persecution for his religion, though he had been in some danger whilst the Queen's severe illness lasted. His enemies sometimes would tell him that warrants were out against him, to which the valiant Protestant said, If they were, and he found them not duly signed, he should go farther than Peter, who only cut off the ear of Malchus, for he should cut off the head and ears, into the bargain, of any messenger who served such warrant. Thus it is certain that the sick queen's signature was not appended to these tyrannical instruments of the cruel inquisition that performed the enormities in Mary's reign after her marriage, for Underhill added, that he considered himself legally authorized in resisting to death any warrant which was not signed by 5 of the council. But if the royal sign manual had been affixed, he could not have said this. Burnet expressly says, neither Mary nor Cardinal Pole were ever at these councils, and that, in the midst of the persecutions, seldom more than 3 sat in consultation. Underhill took the precaution of walling up, with a good barrier of bricks, all his polemic library, in a niche of his bedchamber in Wood Street. He assures his reader they were all released from their concealment as good as new, when the scene changed, at the accession of Elisabeth. Thus this gallant gentleman of the pen and sword weathered all the political and religious storms of the reign of Mary, and lived prosperously till a good old age, under the sway of Elisabeth. In truth, being a country gentleman of family and fortune, he was in little danger, for the ugliest feature of the Marian persecution was, that the vengeance of the inquisitors was principally wreaked on the poor and lowly, whose tortures and sufferings were made terrific examples to their superiors, a mode of proceeding the direct reverse to all former policy in England. Those who were of rank sufficient to have access to the queen were generally pardoned, if she could induce Gardiner to consent. In the cases of Edwin Sandys, Sir John Cheek and her sister Elisabeth, and afterwards Lord Bray, she actively interfered for their preservation. The flight of the Dowager of Suffolk to the Continent seems to have originated as much from her stolen match with Richard Barty as on religious account. In February 1556–57, visits of friendly intercourse were exchanged between the queen and her sister Elisabeth, who spent some weeks at Somerset House. This palace seems to have been granted to the princess by her sister, as her town house. The trouble, and even persecution, with which Dudley had plagued Elisabeth, regarding her claim to Durham House, a much inferior domicile, and her complaints of being bereft of any town house, are the chief topic of her correspondence at the close of Edward VI's life. A contemporary chronicler shows Elisabeth living, with great royalty, at Somerset House, built by the Protector Somerset, by which he had impoverished his family and lost his popularity. Queen Mary returned the frequent visits her sister had made her, during her spring abode at Somerset House, by a progress to Hatfield. Here the next morning, after mass, she was entertained by Elisabeth with a grand exhibition of bear baiting, with which, says the chronicler, their highnesses were right well content. To do Mary justice, this is the only instance recorded of her presence and satisfaction at any exhibition of cruelty. Neither letters, account book, nor any other evidence we have yet discovered, represent her as an encourager or rewarder of the cruel amusements in vogue at her era, and in this, with the exception of her mother, she stands alone among her family. She seldom hunted, even in her youth, and she never swore, either on paper or by utterance. Negative good qualities which candor demands should be recorded to her credit, when so many evil ones have been alleged against her. The evening recreations of Hatfield, it may be considered, were more to the taste of the musical queen than morning bear baiting, for they consisted of concerts, at which her sister Elisabeth amused her by playing on the virginals, accompanied by a chorister boy, who possessed a divine voice. Before the end of the summer, Queen Mary returned the hospitalities at Hatfield by a fête champêtre and alfresco concert at Richmond Palace, of peculiar elegance. The queen sent her barge for her sister, who was again resident in London, at Somerset House. Surely the decorations provided for the triumphal passage up the Thames of Elisabeth, then in the prime of her life and hopes, might have been exceeded by that princess in costliness, when in the zenith of her regal splendour, but never in taste. For Mary had caused her barge to be festooned, for her sister's voyage, with rich garlands of flowers, and covered with an awning of green silk, embroidered with branches of eglantine and golden blossoms. Under this canopy Elizabeth sat in state, attended by the comptroller of her household, Sir Thomas Pope, and 4 of her ladies of honour. 6 boats followed, with the gentlemen of Elizabeth's retinue, who were dressed in russet damask and blue satin, with caps of silver cloth and green plumes. Queen Mary received her sister and her brilliant train in Richmond Palace gardens, and entertained her with a sumptuous banquet, in a pavilion constructed in the labyrinth, in the form of a castle made of cloth of gold and violet velvet, embroidered with silver fleur-de-lis, and her mother's device of the pomegranate in gold. A concert succeeded the banquet, at which the best minstrels in the kingdom gratified the high musical tastes of the royal sisters, but there is no mention made that either bulls, bears, badgers, or any other creatures were baited for their diversion. In the evening, the queen's barge, with its gay garlands, was again launched on the silver Thames for the homeward voyage of the heiress of England, and, followed by the attendant boats, the beautiful water procession safely arrived the same night at Somerset House. The queen had reason soon after to express her high approbation of the dutiful conduct of Elizabeth, regarding the reception of the king of Sweden's proposal of marriage for his heir. Mary's conduct, if examined through the medium of documents, appears conscientious and unexceptionable, regarding all overtures for her sister's marriage. She sent for Sir Thomas Pope, and, after declaring her approval of Elizabeth's reference to herself, respecting the Swedish offer, requesting him to learn her sister's real sentiments, as to whether her constant refusal of suitors proceeded from any objection to the marriage state in general. Section 25.